I would like to welcome you all and thank you for coming and thank first of all Adam Friedlander, who's joining us from Hawaii in the 8 a.m. Time in there. I would just like to briefly introduce the Polar Forum as a place where we hope Oxford researchers and beyond can discuss polar issues. Both Arctic and Antarctic, and across the board in terms of research fields. And today's seminar is going to be led and introduced by our colleague Professor Lisa Wedding, who's a professor associate professor at the School of Geography and the Environment. She has previously worked with our guest speaker today, so we thought that it would be much better if she leads the seminar today. So without further introduction, I leave it to Lisa to introduce the seminar.
Great, thank you so much, Mark. So good evening, everyone in the UK, and aloha and good morning to our speaker, Alan Friedlander, joining us all the way from Hawaii. So I'm really honored to present our speaker this evening, and over the past 35 years, Dr. Friedlander has spent over 10,000 hours underwater, from coral reefs to the poles and to the depths of thousands of meters. And I've been lucky to join him on a mere probably 1,000 of those dives in coral reefs across the Hawaiian archipelago when I was his graduate student there. And now Dr. Friedlander is the chief scientist at National Geographic Society's Pristine Seas program, and he's also a researcher at the University of Hawaii. So essentially, he leads research efforts to help to understand and conserve some of these iconic and special places in the ocean. And he's an expert in marine ecology, in fisheries and conservation. So Alan's work on marine protected areas ranges from some of these small locally managed areas to some of the largest protected areas on the planet. And over the past decade, Alan's led over 30 expeditions to some of the last wild places in the ocean, which have resulted in the creation of 23 large marine protected areas encompassing over 6 million square kilometers. So Alan received his PhD from the University of Hawaii, and he was also a National Research Council postdoctoral associate with NOAA in Monterey, California. And currently, Alan's a fellow at the Royal Geographic Society, the Explorers Club, and along with the National Geographic Pristine Seas team, he was awarded the 2014 Environmental Hero Award, and more recently, the 2016 Crystal Compass National Award from the Russian Geographical Society. So with that, I'll hand it over to Alan now, and he's going to talk to us specifically about his latest expedition to Antarctica. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lisa and Mark, for the invitation. Thanks for the great introduction, Lisa. It's wonderful to see everybody, although it'd be much better in person, but hopefully in the future. Yeah, so today I'd like to talk a little bit about our recent work in Antarctica with the Chilean and Argentine governments. But before that, I want to briefly talk about importance of the ocean and our National Geographic Pristine Seas project and how we've been trying to help save the last wild places in the ocean. So hopefully the screen shares fine. And we can get going here. So so hopefully everybody can see that. As Lisa mentioned, I am chief scientist for Pristine Seas and a researcher at the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology. Today I'm going to discuss about our work in Antarctica. But first I want to talk about the ocean. So why do we care? To most of us, it's remote, don't have a lot of interaction, but life on Earth wouldn't exist without the ocean. It's essential, right? So half of all the oxygen we breathe comes from the ocean. The ocean absorbs 50 times the amount of carbon that the atmosphere does, and it's essential to climate regulation. It provides food, protein to over 1 billion people, billions of people on the planet, livelihoods for tens of millions of people around the world. Ocean harbors the greatest level of higher order biodiversity on the planet. More than twice, 2 times the amount of phyla occur in the ocean than do on land, and 12 phyla are exclusively marine. So it harbors a great deal of higher level biodiversity. Marine tourism and other related activities, hundreds of billions of dollars a year in revenue. And the ocean has a strong cultural connection for many coastal communities. And finally, recreation. We all like to play and do stuff in the ocean, and it's essential to us. So the ocean is obviously very important, but yet the ocean's under a lot of stress. It's literally death by 1,000 cuts. The major stressors are overfishing, coastal pollution, development, and combined with that, climate change, ocean acidification. You can see that much of the world is impacted by humans. And that's no more evident than around Europe, where you guys are, South Asia, around Japan and China, South China Sea, also the Gulf of Thailand. But so there's places that are heavily impacted, the Caribbean, but there's also places that are not as impacted. Areas in blue and light green there, Central Pacific, Gulf of Carpentaria, which is highlighted there between Australia and New Guinea, Torres Straits, and large parts of the Southern Ocean and the polar regions. And that's kind of been the focus of our Pristine Seas project over the last decade or so. And Pristine Seas was started by Enrique Sala, who's explorer in residence at National Geographic in 2008, with the goal of helping to conserve the last wild places in the ocean through marine protected areas, with a combination of research, exploration, media policy, and education. And we've done this working with local partners with the ultimate goal of 30% protection by 2030, which is what people are striving for at a global level. So as Lisa mentioned, we've had 30 expeditions over the last 12 years or so, since 2008, and I've been fortunate enough to be chief scientist on 28 of those. So I've seen virtually every place on this map from pole to pole and every place in between. It's kind of amazing and inspiring to see these places. They are truly unique and rare. We've been really successful. We've got 23 areas protected, over 6 million square kilometers. So that's, more than half the size of Europe during that time. And with a relatively small team, we've been really productive. Over 250 scientific publications, including papers in Science and Nature, 30 documentary films, and a number of short format videos, articles, and so forth that we've used to influence policy. So it's amazing map when you look at it, and it's really, these are kind of the jewels in the crown of the ocean. And what have I learned from swimming around underwater for the last couple decades? What we see in these last wild places are kind of 5 major themes that I want to highlight. They're dominated by large predators. That upper left corner is Caroline Atoll in Southern Line Islands in Kiribati. And that's what a coral reef should look like, dominated by large predators. But yet those are the first thing removed from the ecosystem. Followed by that, we see iconic species, polar bears, whales, walruses. These large keystone species are emblematic of these last wild places. And then endemic species that are found nowhere else on Earth. Because most of these places are remote, they tend to harbor high amounts of endemism. And then architectural species, kelp forests, coral reefs, seagrass beds, mangroves. These provide the 3-dimensional structure that's essential for these last wild places to have this high biodiversity and structural integrity. And finally, intactness. These areas are both resistant to change and also resilient when perturbations occur. So by having all the components of the ecosystem there, we tend to have these last wild places being healthy, emblematic examples of what the ocean used to look like. So a couple brief examples. The Aldabra Marine National Park was just recently created in the Seychelles, 400,000 square kilometers. This was with a Debt for Nature swap with the Paris Club and Nature Conservancy. And this gives a good dichotomy here between these remote isolated islands that are 1,000 kilometers from the populated areas around Mahi in the northern island group. And, you know, they harbor the endemic Aldabra tortoise, sharks, healthy coral reefs, so forth. So these are some data from, along with a colleague I've been working with, Nick Graham at University of Lancaster. And this shows fish biomass across the Seychelles archipelago. So y-axis is biomass in tons per hectare. And we can see that in places that have no protection from fishing, we have extremely low biomass overall. And even in marine protected areas, MPAs, and no-take areas, strongly protected areas, biomass is higher than in the open areas. And there's a few predators there, mainly groupers. But when we look at these remote areas where we've been doing our work in the southern areas that have just recently been protected, biomass is an order of magnitude greater than even in the strongest protected areas in the northern islands. And you can see the abundance of large predators, the red portion of the bar there, which are mainly groupers and jacks and some sharks. So if you didn't have these remote areas, you wouldn't have a good reference because you'd think your no-take marine protected areas are actually doing pretty well. But without remote areas that are conserved, we don't really have good baselines of what ecosystems should look like. Moving on to the South Pacific off the coast of Chile, the Desventurada Islands, the Unfortunate Islands in Spanish. So these islands are about 900 kilometers off the coast of Chile, yet the Humboldt Current is such a strong biogeographic barrier that the assemblages there look nothing like continental Chile. They harbor the endemic Juan Fernandez fur seal, which almost went extinct. This endemic lobster, Jasus frontalis, which supports a fishery in nearby Juan Fernandez. An endemic kelp species of Icenia. So the system is very unique despite its proximity to continental South America. And what we found was truly amazing. The fish assemblages there, they look more like Indo-Pacific fish than they do continental Chile. There's wrasses, butterfly fish, so forth and so on. And it's got the highest amount of marine endemism observed anywhere on Earth. 72 to 88% of all the species, but more importantly, these endemics tend to be overrepresented in these habitats. They proliferate, and so 99%, so virtually every single fish you see on the reef in Desventuradas are found nowhere else on Earth. So a really important global biodiversity hotspot. And then Clipperton Atoll. So this is 3 days by boat from Manzanillo, Mexico, yet it is owned by France. It's a small atoll, only a few kilometers across, uninhabited. There has been a little bit of work done there previously, but nothing done in the deep sea. Submersibles, deep water drop cameras, a number of tools to look at the diversity in the deep sea at Clipperton. And actually, we examined the whole ecosystem from Subtidal down to thousands of meters. And we saw new records for these glass eyes here. Entropterus benchleyi is a lantern shark, which is named after Peter Benchley, the author of Jaws. New species of Antimora, probably, and then this prickly shark. So when you start to look around, particularly in these remote places at deep water, there's a lot of biodiversity that you didn't know existed previously. So now that brings us to Antarctica, the talk that we're all here to talk about. So nobody owns Antarctica. It's one of the last wild places in the ocean. However, climate change and increasing human impacts are having threats to this unique region. And despite the fact that it's important for CO2 drawdown, global climate regulation, it's one of the last wild places, yet we are at a tipping point with Antarctica as we are elsewhere. Antarctica is driven by this amazing amount of productivity that occurs, particularly in the summer months. These fronts that get set up really concentrate a lot of biomass and a lot of productivity around Antarctica. It also is a strong biogeographic barrier. So Antarctica as a whole has a high proportion of endemic species found nowhere else. And the species here have evolved in a relatively stable climate over a long time. And you can see the highlighted orange areas off the Antarctic Peninsula and the Ross Sea, which harbor incredibly high biodiversity, which is the base for the entire food chain in Antarctica. And although the Great Southern Ocean food chain is relatively simple, it's also one of the largest on Earth. So this high productivity driven by phytoplankton is consumed by copepods and, more importantly, krill. Krill are the keystone species in the Antarctic food web. Everything feeds on krill, from the smallest organisms all the way up to the giant whales. And it's essential to the integrity of the entire ecosystem. And a couple species of krill, this is Euphausia superba, the most abundant krill species, and also the target of a fishery, which was started by Russia or the Soviet Union at the time in the 1960s and 70s. And the establishment of this fishery was really part of the impetus for the creation of CAMLAR, which is the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. And so the Antarctic Treaty was established in 1961, a number of contracting parties with the goal of science and peace along the peninsula. There's no militarization of Antarctica. Decisions are always by consensus. And CAMLAR has 26 members, and it's science, about management. It's also conducted by consensus voting. So there are 9 domains within Antarctica as determined by CAMLAR, and we're going to focus on the Western Antarctic Peninsula and South Scotia Arc today, Antarctic Peninsula domain number 1. And just briefly to mention, the Ross Sea was created 2 years ago as the first large-scale marine protected area in Antarctica at over 1 million square kilometers. So that was a large feat. And in January of 2019, we did a binational expedition to the Antarctic Peninsula with the governments of Chile and Argentina to help support their joint proposal to create a network of marine protected areas along the Antarctic Peninsula. And we did this on the Chilean naval vessel, OPV Fuente Alba. And it was an amazing trip. Chile and Argentina don't always get along. In the past, they've had a number of confrontations about land rights and so forth and so on. And so having this cooperative joint effort, literally everybody was at the table here. And so we were able to work together on this for the common good for their joint proposal for Antarctica, which was a pretty exciting and inspiring effort to be part of. Due to the importance of this, the President of Chile and First Lady of Chile made a guest appearance. So they flew down to Antarctica and met the boat along with the Minister of Defense and the Commander of the Navy. And there was also really good support from the President of Argentina at the time. So this brought a lot of visibility to the expedition and helped to elevate its importance. So we started at Punta Arenas in Chile, went through the Straits of Magellan, down through the Beagle Channel, across the Drake Passage. We had a fairly uneventful passage. It can often be sometimes hair-raising down there. It's some of the roughest ocean in the world, the confluence of the Atlantic Pacific, the Great Southern Ocean, unobstructed by any continent. So that just can have really awful sea conditions down there. We made it down to the South Shetland Islands, where many of the bases are, down the Dunkirk coast, down to the Gerlach Strait, where we had to turn around because we got sucked in by ice, and then turned around and worked our way back home. So we used a combination of different tools, scuba, deep water cameras, plankton nets, and so forth to examine the peninsula and try to help support Chile and Argentina's proposal. So ice is the dominant feature in Antarctica. It dictates, where things live. It really dominates how the subtidal communities look, and the movement of ice is really critical to understanding what the living marine communities are like down in Antarctica. Abrasions of ice can occur down to tens of meters, so it really sculpts and modifies the whole ecosystem. And glaciers are retreating fairly rapidly in Antarctica, which is opening up a lot of space for benthic organisms, but there's obviously negative sides to that as well. Some of the older communities are being ground up and starting over again from new. So it's at a transition point right now due to the rapidly warming water. And the Western Antarctic Peninsula is warming virtually faster than any place else on the planet. So it's ground zero for climate change. I think what was most amazing to me is when you get down to these deeper water depths, 40 and 50 meters, it's an entirely different community. These areas down here are free from ice scour. So these are persistent communities. And even though the water temperature is -1, life thrives literally down here. Most families and larger taxonomic groupings are absent or poorly represented in Antarctica, but a few groups have just proliferated. The ascidians, the sea squirts, sponges, some gorgonians. You go down here at 40 or 50 meters and you see these lush gardens. It could be a coral reef for that matter if you weren't wearing a full suit and the water wasn't -1 degrees. But these areas kind of blow you away how diverse and how beautiful it is. You think it's going to be totally lifeless down there, and life literally thrives in these environments. So the major habitats are these soft bottom communities dominated by mobile species such as sea stars, brittle stars, urchins, and then the slope communities that are, constantly being motivated or, modeled or moved around by ice, these large communities of macroalgae. And then we have overhangs and deeper water communities that have more persistent communities of gorgonians, sponges, sea anemones that create a lot of structure that are important for the rest of the organisms. Kind of a schematic of what we saw in the subtidal community. So in the shallows, we see a lot of encrusting coralline algae and a lot of red algae, and these are pretty much ground up every year come winter time. Between about 10 and 30 meters, we see two dominant species of macroalgae, Desmoretzia and the Hymenophthalmus. And these are large macroalgae that kind of dominate in these habitats and provide a lot of habitat for other organisms. Below about 30 meters or so, where ice scour is less, we see more persistent communities like sponges and gorgonians. And so the community changes dramatically with depth, and it's all driven by ice. Desmoretzia in these 20 to 30, 10 to 20, 30 meter range, they perform a lot of structural integrity where you've got urchins and brittle stars and sea stars and all these other organisms are utilizing the structure that's created by these large macroalgae beds. And there's no laminarian kelps in Antarctica. And in its place, we see this Hymenophthalmus, which forms these long blades that can extend down for tens of meters. And they don't have gas bladders like typical kelp. So it's more of a horizontal forest than a vertical forest that we typically see in a kelp community. So really interesting habitat. And then below that, the sponges, the ascidians, soft corals, and again, while many groups are underrepresented in Antarctica, the ascidians and sponges and some of the others are actually overrepresented. And despite the fact that they're on different ends of the evolutionary spectrum, they have both figured out how to make a living down in -1 degree water. So it's it's really a mixed and unique fauna that we see in Antarctica, especially in the deeper habitats. And these deeper habitats provide a lot of structure, but for the most part, they are sessile. They're suspension feeders, taking advantage of the large amounts of productivity, but they're also very susceptible to climate change. So as the ocean warms, these animals obviously can't move. So they are, very susceptible to any changes in water temperature and ocean acidification. They've evolved over a long time in a relatively stable environment. And with the rapidly changing climate in Antarctica, we just don't know what these communities are going to look like into the future. Glass sponge, this is the largest sponge in Antarctica. This is at 50 meters in just off of one of the Argentine bases. I remember this dive very well. These sponges are so big that you can crawl inside of them. They're 2 meters across. They provide their own habitat. They're kind of amazing. And again, probably something that's relatively slow growing, and who knows what the implications of climate change will be on these and these other organisms. Just to reiterate the overhangs, so even in relatively shallow water, you can have these persistent communities as long as they're out of the reach of ice. So you get these beautiful overhangs with gorgonians and anemones and a lot of other sponges, sessile organisms that have escaped the decimation by ice. And the invertebrate communities along the peninsula and the outlying islands break out pretty much between soft bottom and hard bottom communities. So on the left of this plot, we see the red dots, mainly around Deception Island. And these are soft bottom communities, and they're dominated by a mix of different feeding strategies. Brittle stars and isopods are scavengers. These urchins are grazers, and then suspension feeders like these soft corals and the clams. The hard bottom communities are dominated also by some suspension feeders, some sponges, the ascidians or sea squirts, and also have a lot of these predatory sea stars associated with them. The fish communities in Antarctica are fairly depauperate. No, they're extremely depauperate compared to most other places, actually. The one family that has proliferated are the notonaeids, or the cod ice fish. And they have a antifreeze glycoprotein that prevents their blood and the tissue from freezing up in -1 degree water. And they are undergoing fairly rapid evolutionary diversification at this point. But most of the other fish families are underrepresented or not present at all within Antarctica. So the fish are not a huge component of the Antarctic nearshore marine ecosystems. One interesting fish is the dragonfish. This is one of the larger nearshore fishes in Antarctica, about 50 centimeters across. It is the only vertebrate that doesn't have hemoglobin genes or the or red blood cells. So it achieves respiration by having a very large heart and just pumping a lot of blood through as quickly as it can. In addition, it kind of lays around and doesn't move much, and the water is super saturated with oxygen. And so as a result, it's able to make a living and thrive without having any hemoglobin. So it's kind of an amazing adaptation to life in this environment. As I said, the fish community is fairly depauperate. There were only 7 species that we found on our surveys in the shallow water environment, and there's a fair amount of overlap among all these different fishes. The dragonfish, the black ice codfish, and notice nudifrons, which is the gaudy cod ice fish. Those species asterisk are endemic to the Western Antarctic Peninsula and Scotia Arc. So they're even within Antarctica, these 3 species are uniquely endemic just to that region. And there's, like I said, there's a fair amount of overlap among the assemblages across where we surveyed. The three species on the bottom were the most abundant, and they tended to be, had higher abundance more towards the King George Island, 25 de Mayo in Argentina. And these, this is more along the South Shetland Islands. So the northern part of the area that we're looking at tended to have a higher abundance of fish species, but overall richness was low. One of the recent published papers from this expedition has been what we looked at along the continental shelf using our deep water drop cameras. So the Antarctic continental shelf is deeper than all other continental shelves on Earth, about 450 meters on average, up to 1,000 meters. And that's due to, you know, ice scour and just depression from the sheer weight of all the ice of the Antarctic continent makes the shelf much deeper. We at National Geographic have developed these deep water drop cameras, which have been to the bottom of Marianas Trench, 10,000 meters, and fortunately back again. So that's a good thing. They're relatively easy to deploy. The president of Chile in the lower right there, we gave him a go at it, and he deployed one of the drop cameras. And we looked at the three major habitats again, the South Shetland Islands, Deception Island, and then along the Antarctic Peninsula. And some of the common taxa that we saw on these drop cameras were, so krill and amphipods were found on virtually every single drop. Soft bottom communities had a lot of brittle stars and other mobile species. This penigoni on the right is the second row is interesting. That's a bathypelagic cucumber, and the insert there is the pelagic phase. And that's just to highlight the fact that in these deeper habitats, we have a lot of bathypelagic coupling that's going on. So organisms are taking advantage of the richness and productivity of the pelagic ecosystem at these deeper depths. The Notolepsis, the Jonas fish, feeds exclusively on krill, so one of the more interesting fish species that we see in these deeper depths. And then I want to highlight in the lower right panel is Pleurogramma antarctica. This is the only true pelagic fish species found in Antarctica, and it's a keystone species. It's critical feed for seals, sea lions, and penguins. So a critical part of the ecosystem at these deeper depths. A number of taxa create what's called vulnerable marine ecosystems by CAMLAR. And these are biogenic structures that create habitat for other organisms. Things like number one, the anemones, or two, gorgonians, the sponges, number 3, 4 is not a not a sessile marine ecosystem. That's a crocodile ice fish. The basket stars, the sea cucumbers, and then number 7 is a stalked ascidian or sea squirt. It looks like a little lollipop there, and that provides structure for a lot of other organisms. So this plot here shows the distribution of species from the deep water drop cameras, and the bubbles represent the different locations. So green is Deception Island, the gray is King George, South Shetland Islands, and the orangish beige is the Western Antarctic Peninsula. The bubbles are proportional to depth. So the largest bubbles, 800 meters plus, those are in the upper right-hand corner of the plot. They primarily occurred on the Western Antarctic Peninsula. So it's a little confounding, the depth and location, but most of the deeper depths tended to be found on the peninsula as opposed to the outlying islands. So what we see in these deeper depths is that there's a mix of different taxa, both pelagic species like the squid, Notolepsis is kind of pelagic, but also benthic, some of the sea cucumbers, so a real mix of taxa. And then along King George Island, the South Shetland, we have more sessile or more benthic organisms, such as sea stars, the meridian worm that we see here. And so different mixes depending on the different depths. So there's also a number of threats to Antarctica. Probably the most urgent and obvious one right now is the krill fishery. Krill fishery started in the 1960s by the Soviets and then followed by the Japanese. Krill has become very popular in recent years as a supplement, so the krill fishery is taking place. It was fairly hard to preserve krill the way that it was harvested in the past. The Norwegians have recently come up with a giant underwater vacuum cleaner that sucks up the krill, and it preserves it much better, but yet they're a lot more efficient at harvesting krill. So it's certainly a fishery that has direct impacts to the entire ecosystem, and really the most prevalent, really the only fishery right now of any consequence in Antarctica. And krill have moved dramatically in the area over the last 100 years. If you look in the early 1920s to 1930s, krill populations were concentrated around the South Georgia Islands. And then moving forward into the 70s and up into the 90s, we see them still prevalent around South Georgia, but concentrations of krill are moving more along the peninsula and moving south, presumably because of warmer temperatures. And finally, more recently, we see a virtual absence of krill around South Georgia, or much diminished there, and really high concentrations along the peninsula, mainly Banfield Straits, the Mar de la Flota in Argentine language. So these concentrations in these reaches around the peninsula are a bit problematic because they compete directly, the fishery there competes directly with foraging of seals, sea lions, penguins, and other organisms. And we can see this from this plot here in Domain 1. The concentrations of the krill fishery are on the South Orkney Islands in the upper right-hand there, and then mainly around the Banfield Straits. So again, this is the major foraging area for a lot of marine mammals and other organisms. So the fishery is directly competing with these organisms at this point. So it's not the absolute amount of krill that's being harvested is well within sustainable limits. It's just that where it's targeting them and when it's targeting them directly competes with the integrity of the overall ecosystem. And then again, climate change is the major driver of what's going on in Antarctica these days. And nowhere is that more prevalent than on the peninsula and East Antarctica. You can see this NASA rendition of changes in ice mass over the last 100 years. And the areas in red highlight the areas that have changed most during that time period. So obviously the peninsula and East Antarctica have seen rapid changes in ice during the past 100 years. And now we'll get on to some of the other more charismatic organisms. There's about 45 species of birds found in Antarctica. So obviously a really important habitat for these birds, for nesting, for feeding, for reproduction, really, really important. And these are chinstrap and gentoo penguins. Another shot of chinstrap and gentoo because nobody ever gets tired of looking at penguins, and it's a beautiful photo, compliments of National Geographic. So there have been winners and losers as a result of climate change. And Adelie penguins were very common along Antarctic Peninsula around Palmer Station, and their populations have declined dramatically since the late 1970s, early 1980s. Adelies like to nest on ice-free and snow-free areas along rocky shorelines because of increased ice melt and precipitation in Antarctica. Antarctica is typically dry, but increased precipitation because of climate change have caused high mortality of these nests and chicks. And so that's one reason that the populations have declined. Also, adelies and chinstraps forage offshore, and they compete directly with whales, humpback whales, other whales, which had rebounded substantially since the cessation of whaling. And so they're directly competing with those whales for for feed. Conversely, the gentoos have been moving south over time and have done very well. They're a colonizing species. They tend to forage closer to shore and have taken advantage of this ice-free area. And so they have done relatively well compared to the Adelis and the chinstraps over the last 30 years or so. Another species that's done pretty well has been the Weddell seals, even though it looks kind of bored with the whole situation. They have rebounded dramatically since the cessation of harvest. They were for their blubber and their oil, and there's nearly 1 million of these now in around Antarctica. So another conservation success story with this population is doing relatively well. If we combine looking at all the bird layers. So this is data from the Chilean, Argentinian, the British Antarctic Survey. A number contributed to these data layers, which included seabirds and various marine mammals. And we can see the high concentrations for breeding and foraging areas along the South Orkney Islands, South Shetland Islands, the Gerlach Straits, the Banfield Straits. So this whole peninsula area is just really, really important for all of these megafauna of seabirds and marine mammals. When we think about threats, we have to think about past threats as well. This is Deception Island. It's an active volcano. It actually erupted twice in the 1960s. People had to be evacuated from there. It's an interesting spot. You can go down by the beach with a shovel and dig a nice little hole and go in your swim trunks. The water is relatively warm, a little bit of a sauna. So, but over the course of time, starting in the early part of the 20th century, the Norwegians and the Chileans established stations there for whale processing, and over 1 million whales were slaughtered during that time period. And the remnants of this are still obviously there. The big boilers that are present along the shoreline where they rendered all the whale blubber into oil. It's kind of amazing when we think about it. You know, that was just to light cities all throughout the Northern Hemisphere during that time, and 1 million+ whales were killed just for that purpose. You also see the remnants of this everywhere. Whale bones are littered everywhere along the shoreline around Deception Island. And we even see whale bones underwater in lots of places. So there's a lasting impact that goes on there from all the previous activities. So we just have to be cognizant of the fact that even though activities have ceased, you know, decades ago, there's still, you know, impacts that linger. And future potential threats are tourism. So tourism is currently managed now very sustainably by the Antarctic Treaty. There are specific places where tourists can go, and tourism is highly regulated in Antarctica, which is a great thing. Last year, or 2018, 2019, saw the largest number of tourists at any point in Antarctica, over 50,000. Which doesn't seem like a lot, but it's a lot for a place like this. They have managed to congregate tourists in a few select places to try to minimize the impacts. And that's highlighted here by the number of visitors. But that said, there will be increasing pressure to expand tourism, I'm sure, as time goes on, as ice frees up and you can go further down in places, the peninsula that were once locked in ice. So this is something where the precautionary principle really needs to be invoked to have wise use of Antarctica for tourism. And then when there's a combination of 150+ data layers that were used to create priority conservation areas to support the creation of the marine protected area network that Argentina and Chile have proposed. And that's highlighted in yellow here as the places that are most important. The South Orkney Islands, South Shetland Islands, areas along the peninsula are obviously hotspots for all different kinds of taxa and fauna and flora that are in need of conservation. So this is what the proposal looks like from Chile, and Argentina. The areas in purple are general protection areas. These are areas where no activities will, no extractive activities will take place. The areas in green are the special fisheries management zones, and those are areas where the krill fishery will be allowed to go on. But they've also established what's called krill fishery research zones, these reddish areas. And those are reference areas for the krill fishery. So the proposal is that once a decade, these areas will be harvested to determine what the biomass is and compare that to areas that are being harvested by krill. So these reference zones are critical to determining whether the krill fishery is sustainable and having a negative impact on the entire ecosystem. So that's pretty much it. You know, Antarctica is changing very rapidly, particularly the West Antarctic Peninsula. And the proposal by Chile and Argentina is a bold move and very timely considering everything that's going on globally and in Antarctica. This year's meeting of CAMLAR in Hobart, Australia was done virtually, and there wasn't a lot done because of COVID, but we're really hoping that over the course of the next year, that we can work with all of the CAMLAR members to put forward good science to show where this area should be protected and how Antarctica should be protected into the future. So it was a collaborative effort, a lot of support by the Chilean government, the Argentine government, National Geographic, a lot of partners, a lot of good data. And so we feel like the outcome is headed in the right direction now. Plus we had a lot of fun. You know, somebody from Hawaii doesn't get to dive around in Antarctica very often. So it was an amazing experience and I really would like to go back. So thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Alan. And we'll go ahead and open it up to questions now. So if some folks feel comfortable, go ahead, and I encourage you to turn your video on so Alan can meet some of you. So we can open it up to questions. Mark also put a comment in the comment board. So if anyone wants to type out their questions in the chat, you can feel free to do that as well. But just to get us started, Alan, could you tell us a little more about how the data from your expedition was used and incorporated into that MPA design process? So we saw sort of that final map or that final design scenario, and I'm interested in how the expedition played a role in all the data layers that fed into that, and then second, I suppose if you can, maybe a little background on some of the stakeholder discussions that maybe fed into some of that MPA design as well.
Right. So a lot of the data layers and the proposal were done prior to our expedition. And again, this was driven mainly by Chile and Argentina, but all of the members of CAMLAR, you know, British Antarctic Survey, a lot of other science organizations, all contributed to those data layers, the Mark-Sand analysis that was conducted to determine, you know, optimal sample design and so forth. The expedition itself was trying to focus on places where there were data gaps. So a lot of the work in Antarctica has been typically done around research stations. Because we had a big naval vessel, we were able to go to places that hadn't been visited very much. So that didn't necessarily go particularly into the design or into those data layers. It just helps to highlight additional information that can support that. And we're also there, I mean, we produced the documentary film, we had the president of Chile come down. So a lot of it was engagement and support for the proposal and not necessarily a lot of new scientific information, although, you know, we did publish the work on the continental shelf and there'll be some more work to come out of that. So we'll contribute to future efforts. I can't talk per se to the stakeholder engagement because I wasn't involved in that aspect of it. I saw a chat that somebody had about how CAMLAR and the Antarctic Treaty are done by consensus. And yes, that is always a problem. And We have been working with our partners for some of the countries who are reluctant to move forward with additional protection for Antarctica. And that's part of the process that's going to be going on over the next year.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So it sounds like you've answered Tom's question about the CAMLAR process and how it's run by consensus, but Maria also asked about the movement of krill in the South, is that it's very interesting and alarming. And her question is, are higher trophic levels moving south as well and keeping pace with the krill, or is there a trophic mismatch?
You know, it's a bit of a moving target, right? It's happening really relatively quickly in ecological terms. So yes, I mean, a lot of the animals are following the krill because they're dependent on it. And as we saw, things are moving further down the strait. So penguins and whale, you know, particularly whales and a lot of the mobile animals that are not as tied to land are definitely moving south with the krill. And as more ice is retreating and opening up, there's a lot more habitat available. So, you know, that's a good thing. Whale populations are definitely rebounding in Antarctica, as are some of the seal populations. But as we see some of the things that are tied more closely to land, like some of the penguins, are not doing as well as a result of changes in what's going on land.
Thank you. Okay, thanks, Maria. And then we've got another question from Gila asking, from a policy perspective, in your view, how did Chile and Argentina come to view setting up an MPA as something in their interest?
Well, I can't speak directly to that, but from our engagement is that, you know, they're neighbors. We work together with, we work separately with Chile and Argentina, and then together we worked around Cape Horn and Diego Ramirez in Chile, around Cape Horn Archipelago, and more recently in Kawasca and the fjords. But we also worked in the Mitre Peninsula and Isla de los Estados in Argentina, and we helped to set up 2 adjacent parks there, and kind of a first unprecedented example of a potential peace park between the 2 countries. And so that kind of covers the southern cone of South America. And I think a natural extension of that is Chile and Argentina both have several bases in Antarctica. They are close proximity there. They're actively engaged there, and they've got active research institutes on Antarctica and in Argentina and Chile. And I think there was a natural logic there for them to work together. Also, I think there's a lot of inertia against additional protection. The Ross Sea was a large challenge to get that protected. And I think there was reluctance to move forward. But I think by having a binational joint proposal by Chile and Argentina, it gives it a lot more strength and a lot more credibility within the consortium. But that's secondhand. So
thank you for that. Yeah, I'm just interested in sort of how to bring data to governments and get them to think about this as being something in their interest. So that was my question, the root of my question.
Right. Yeah. I think, you know, from our perspective, it was more highlighting all the amazing work that has previously been done through the film, which is, there's a link to it. I don't know if anybody had seen it. But a lot of the media products that we created, and we use the mouthpiece that National Geographic has, and the so many touch points, and, you know, how many people it reaches to help support those efforts by Chile and Argentina, and ultimately, hopefully, by CAMLAR as a whole.
Great, thank you, Gila. And Mark also asked, building from an earlier question, he says, linked to this movement, what about invasives from outside Antarctica?
Right. So that is a big concern right now. There's a lot of biosecurity control that is taking place in Antarctica, and it's you know, it's a huge issue. On land, for the most part, there's a little bit of concern from the sea. So they are like crabs, for instance, are not represented at all in Antarctica until recently, and not many large fish too. So animals that can crush other animals are not a huge component of the ecosystem currently in Antarctica. But as the water warms, as crabs and maybe more fish species start to show up, that has implications for all those other animals that were used to not being crushed before. So there's, you know, evolutionary implications and ecological implications as well. On land, yes, I mean, there's been, there's seaweed, there's algae and plants and a lot of other organisms that are probably going to be established as time goes on, and it's something that is going to require a lot of diligence, and it's going to be costly.
Great. Okay, thanks, Mark. And Bettina asked, given the data gaps, are those areas kept out of the marine protected area design or kept in as a precaution? So, for example, in case they are highly biodiverse and we just don't know that yet.
Right. So this is like when I talked about the vulnerable marine ecosystems. So when you highlight vulnerable marine ecosystems, they automatically get an asterisk and you know, deserve protection. There are probably lots and lots of vulnerable marine ecosystems out there that have not been evaluated or identified yet. So they took a broad precautionary approach for obvious reasons. There's data gaps, but also because ground zero for climate change means that we don't know what these ecosystems are going to look like in the future. So the precautionary, you know, approach is definitely warranted. And like with the krill fishery, like I said, the fishery itself is well below maximum sustainable yield. It's just a question of how it interacts with all of the other organisms when and where harvest takes place. So that is built into the design, and I think there's probably some adaptation that can happen over time. Obviously, when you create a protected area or a network of protected areas, there's the ability to adapt and change relative to changing situation on the ground or in the water in this case.
All right, thank you. So we don't have any more questions in the chat, but I welcome anyone just to jump in and shout out any questions. But we do have a few comments. There's a few saying that the film is great and highly recommended. And I just have one, I guess, follow-up question. So moving from Antarctica, from this expedition, maybe you could give us a teaser, maybe 2-minute overview of the Arctic expedition that you were a part of, and perhaps this can set the stage for a future Polar Forum talk.
Hopefully in person.
Yes.
So yeah, several years ago, we had the pleasure of going to Franz Josef Land in the Russian Arctic, and we were the first non-Russian led expedition allowed to go up there. It was a joint expedition with the Russian Academy of Sciences. It was exciting. Not much was known about it. A lot of the literature published is in Russian, so it was an interesting place to go. We learned a lot. It was a 6-week expedition, pretty rugged conditions in general, and a lot of different cultural things going on between Russian and non-Russian expedition teams. So I learned a lot culturally from the whole thing. So I would love to come talk about it. We had a lot of good scientific outputs from that, and the Russian Arctic National Park got expanded to include Franz Josef Land, 10,000 square kilometers, I think, as a result of that expedition. So it was highly impactful.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you. We look forward to that talk then at a future date. And thanks everyone for joining early evening. And thanks, Alan, for waking up early and giving a talk in Hawaii.
I was already up, and thank you. Thanks, everybody. I enjoyed it.
Well, thank you, Alan. And I would just like to remind you that next week we have another seminar, and the seminar is going to be held by Henry Burgers, who is the head of the NERC Arctic Research Office, which is based at the British Antarctic Survey in Cambridge, and he's going to talk about UK research in the Arctic in general from the point of view of the NERC Arctic Office. But apart from this announcement, I would like to reiterate my thanks to Alan and to Lisa. Lisa for inviting him, and Alan for accepting the invitation, and for giving us so many things to think about the West Antarctic Peninsula ecosystem. So having said that, and thank you for coming, and see you around.
All right.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Aloha.
Aloha.